He was contacted by a tribal leader in the Libyan desert, a sort of nomadic peoples. And their message was, we've met Jesus and we need to get baptized. And we know that we need a sheikh to teach us, to mentor us. So nothing unusual there. So he does this huge journey of about 1,500 kilometers across the desert to meet this guy. Meets him, his wife, and about 5 or 6 other members of his closer family within this tribe that he leads. And he says, tell me about your dream. He said, no, we didn't have a dream. He just walked into our tent at midday and stayed with us for 6 hours and then disappeared.
Hi guys, welcome back to Raw Mission, the podcast where we hear stories of ordinary men and women who've experienced the goodness of God and have responded to his call, his command, his invitation to take the good news to the least reached. Today I'm joined by one of my best friends from university days, who grew up in Algeria, served in Tunisia, and has recently completed his PhD on the Emerging Muslim Background Church of North Africa. Pat will be sharing some of the lessons he learned from what he calls a failed church plant in Tunisia, as well as some incredible stories of persecution, courage, and an embodied visitation of Jesus to some Libyan nomads.
So we're going to jump straight into it. You've got lots and lots of stories to share from your experiences in the Middle East, North Africa, all over the world these days. But tell us about your background. Where did you grow up and what was that family like that you grew up in?
So my opening gambit is that I was made in New Zealand, delivered in England, assembled in North Africa, and then upgraded through a lifelong partnership with a Scot. There you go. That's the most succinct version. So I'm originally...
All right, let's unpack that.
So yeah, I'm originally from New Zealand. My parents were missionaries. They left New Zealand just before I was born. So my mother was pregnant with me. They stopped off in the UK for a year and a half. My dad was supposed to be doing some training with Jim Packer, who was at Trinity in Bristol at the time, but then he moved back to North America. And so instead he did a curacy there as they prepared for heading to North Africa. And then in 73, I think it was, they moved to Tunisia for a year. And then the opportunity opened up to go and be the chaplain of Holy Trinity Church, which was the Anglican church in Algiers. And so he took that position in 1974. And so that's where I grew up, basically. We were there for 20 years until the sort of bloody decade of the 1990s when, it was just horrific and they had death threats during that time.
Just before we get into that, tell me more about your childhood. How old were you when you were growing up there and when did you leave and come to England?
So I was, I guess, a year old when we moved to Tunisia, then 2 years old when we moved to Algeria. I was educated at a French Algerian school for about 3 years and then to an American international school for about 5 years. And then at the age of 13 was sent to boarding school to a little school called St. John's School in Leatherhead in Surrey. And it had a foundation for sons of clergy, which is how I got my scholarship. Mm-hmm. My 2 brothers had been there before me. And then we came home at least once a year. So many memories. I think, when you're growing up somewhere like that, it's just your life. And so it was a sort of, a different life, an odd life, I guess, in many ways. My mum worked full time at the American school because we didn't have enough finances in terms of support. And dad, he was doing the job of a chaplain serving, I guess, the international evangelical community in that church, but he also had a heart for the local church and so developed relationships with a small number of Algerian believers, that time probably no more than 100 in the 70s in Algeria. Now it's, closer to 100,000. But yeah, so we did have contact with local believers, but he was mainly serving the expat community. And I guess, there was amazing things about growing up in that environment. I was speaking French from a young age and then much later on started to learn Arabic. The first Arabic that I learned were sort of all the swear words and street Arabic. And then boarding school was a whole other experience. It was okay for me, but it's a sort of odd and in many ways not ideal to be sent away at that age. But there were good aspects of that as well. And then after boarding school, I spent a year back in Algeria and started to study dialectical Algerian Arabic and did a bit of traveling around North Africa. So,
So what was it like in terms of faith? Did you grow up sort of trusting in Jesus, knowing, obviously you heard about him all your childhood growing up, but some pastors' kids, missionary kids, they have their years when they go well away from their parents' faith. How was it for you?
Yeah. I guess for me, there's no doubt that the most formative influence in terms of my encounter with Christ and my discipleship was my parents. I mean, it was their example. They were far from perfect, but there was real faith, and I saw real sacrifice. And then when I got to boarding school, I guess was where that faith was really tested. And I'd say it was probably in my sixth form years when I started to understand not just, what I believed and what I was saying yes to, but also somehow the cost of discipleship and what it meant to really, take up my cross. And then in my year off after school, I had a really clear sense that God was calling me back to this region. And in some ways I was reluctant. I didn't want that because that was what my parents had done. And whilst there were many good things about growing up in Algeria, there are many things that I missed about not having a childhood and, experiences in the UK or somewhere else. I never went to any Christian camps and holidays and various other things that I saw Christian friends had benefited from. But yeah, it was very clear at that time. And then once I got to university, there were lots of opportunities to grow there. You and I met there.
Yeah.
We had Christians in sport. Right. We had a great Christian union. We had good churches and so many opportunities to really be open about your faith.
When you arrived at Durham, at university up there, were you already committed to serving overseas in potentially North Africa? I can't remember.
Yeah, I was. I think that's, in some ways, that was even part of the decision of why I studied Arabic. I did Middle Eastern and Islamic studies as an undergrad. And part of the reason for choosing that, well, partly it was an easier course to get into university. I wanted to go to Durham. My brother had been there. It was a good university. And I wasn't very academic at school. And it was an easier course to get onto. So, but it was also because I wanted to study Arabic. I wanted to read the Quran. I wanted to be able to read Arabic sources. And yeah, as you say, when I got there, I had a sort of sense that, God was calling me back to the Muslim world and to North Africa.
I can't remember exactly when we first met up there, but we certainly at some point, maybe my second year there, or perhaps it was my third year, I think you must have said, let's start a little prayer group for the Muslim world. Because that formed, didn't it, in our third year, and we started thinking about doing a short-term trip together.
That's right, yeah.
That.
We did. I think you'd been to Albania, hadn't you? And you'd had some other short-term experience. And we were, praying together. We were both involved in different sports and sharing the good news with our friends and encouraging each other. And then, there was that opportunity in our third year to do a trip somewhere to the Muslim world. We didn't know where, or maybe even somewhere in the UK, in a sort of more Muslim area of the UK. And, we ended up going to Morocco. And so, that was quite a key time praying and preparing for that trip.
Well, it was huge in lots of ways. I mean, for me, it was my first Muslim world experience. It absolutely confirmed for me that God wanted me to work amongst Muslims. Not necessarily Morocco, but big confirmation for that. For you, potentially, I suppose that was another step in the journey. But of course, that's where you met the Scot that you mentioned earlier, dear Kitty. And you were, I don't know how you focused on leading that trip.
You enjoyed the fact that you knew that I had my eyes on Kitty, but there was a definite rule that there would be no relationships on the team.
Lots of teasing going on there, definitely. Yeah, but we took a minibus, didn't we? All the way from England.
Yeah.
And we drove down through France and Spain and into Morocco and down quite far south in Morocco, didn't we? We got up into the Atlas Mountains. It was a great trip.
It was. We were stopping at the side of the road and then doing these faith expeditions with no money and no bag and all the rest of it, and hoping that we'd get invited into houses, which, mostly we did. And it was a kind of crazy time. I'm not sure in terms of strategy whether you'd advise it, but it was certainly faith building. And I think formative. And I remember, we had lots of opportunities to share and
And it was billed as a prayer trip, really. I mean, I remember being told that you probably won't get into lots of conversations with Muslims because it's just an exposure to the Muslim world trip for you. And we certainly didn't have Arabic or anything like that, like you did. But I remember the first night we arrived on the beach in northern Morocco. Where was it? Was it Tangiers or Ceuta or somewhere like that?
Yeah, somewhere like that.
And I think we were sleeping out on the sand and you were just off around a fire with a bunch of guys just chatting all about the Lord and using your Arabic. And I just thought, wow, this is just day one. We're definitely going to be sharing the gospel with people. I remember meeting a Muslim who'd had a dream of Jesus at one point too. But it was a great trip.
It was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then shortly after that trip, was it a year or so later that you got married to Kitty?
Yeah, it was about 2 years later, I think. So that was the summer of our third year. We had another year. And then, we got engaged after we graduated. And then we got married a year later, summer 96.
Yeah. And you, like I, went on to do a little bit of school teaching, secondary school teaching before heading out overseas, right?
Yeah, that's right. had 5 years teaching religious studies and then specializing in Islamic studies at A level, which is quite unusual. Not that many schools teach that, but that was good training.
And then which year was it then that you and Kitty headed to North Africa, and how did that all come about? You went with an organization that's not our one, but great friends of ours.
Yeah, a kind of sister organization, and we're still linked with that same mission family. So we went out to Tunisia in 2001, and we were in the capital for about 3 years, and then just under 3 years down in the south, not far from the Libyan border, in a sort of, it's a place that it definitely wasn't God-forsaken because God loves the place, but it was not a very desirable place to live there. Tunis, the capital, was much more cosmopolitan, and it was a good environment for Kitty to learn Arabic. I obviously had some Arabic myself. And there was this sort of young Tunisian church there that we connected with. And that was a wonderful time. We supported one of the young fellowships, and I had lots of opportunities for evangelism. I was teaching at the university, and we had the privilege of seeing a few young Tunisians come to faith and watching them grow in the faith. And one of those guys is married now, and they're some of my best friends. And it's been amazing just to kind of see the story continue with him growing more than whatever it is, 20, 25 years now. He's got kids, and to see that second generation, it's really quite wonderful. But those 3 years were followed by 2.5 really tough years down in the south. It was a much more arid environment, both, physically and spiritually. It's funny, the year before we'd come, there was a kind of whole year of prayer, intense prayer and evangelism. It was called Awake Tunisia 99. And the year when we arrived, there were teams of people doing prayer ministry. It was grandly called the Company of the Prophets, but we used to go and meet once a month and pray for cities and just try and listen to the Lord. And then that eventually morphed, and we were involved in a sort of longer commitment to 7 years of humble, united and bold prayer for Tunisia. And one of the first trips we were down in the city, Gabas, which was near the Libyan border. And Kitty had said, whatever happens, Lord, never send me to this place, because it was polluted and not very nice. And sure enough, 2.5 years later, that's exactly where we ended up.
Go on, tell us a bit more about why it was so tough down there.
Oh, well, for one thing, there was a chemical processing factory just up the road. So all these European ships would come with all the kind of toxic waste that they're not allowed to process in Europe. And commercially, it was, I think, good for Tunisia to process that. And so they would do that in this factory. And once or twice a month, you'd get this wave of kind of smog that would come across the city. But it wasn't just smog, it was toxic. You could feel like the sort of tinniness, and you had to shut the windows and shutters. And lots of people had health problems, which of course were never really reported on. But the water table had dropped. It used to be an oasis, a beautiful, beautiful place, somewhere where you could have had amazing hotels and tourism, but the toxic waste from this chemical plant was just killing all the palm trees and everything else. And then spiritually, it was really just a dry place. I think as you headed down south, there was something about the spiritual atmosphere. I hadn't had a lot of experience with praying or spiritual warfare as such, but we witnessed some weird stuff happening. Some very mature Christians who are mission partners who'd come, and one of them, as a result of being in this environment in the south, had somehow been demonized. It was very, very strange. I'd never had experience of seeing a Christian who was clearly struggling with, spiritual oppression. And so with a number of others, fortunately, some people who had experience in prayer and deliverance ministry, we prayed for this guy. But I think it was just a harder place spiritually to be. We did witness some believers coming to faith in that city. And I guess when people ask me about that, I say we had experience of a failed church plant. So we did see a small group form, and we worked with them to try and help them be self-sufficient, knowing that we were not going to be there that long, but they didn't last. The group fell apart.
Do you have any ideas of things you would do differently if you had that time all over again, or any insights as to why potentially it fell apart? Was it internal fighting? Was it just relying on the Westerners too much? Was it just different tribes coming together that weren't natural?
It was a combination of things. I think for about a year, it was a really positive experience. We were having fellowship meetings, about 3 or 4 Tunisian believers, and then a group of us who were on a sort of international team. So we were made up of people serving from different contexts. A number of us had enough Arabic so that it could function well. So it looked like New Testament church. We were reading the scriptures, we were worshipping, we were sharing the Lord's Supper. I think we didn't think enough about what it is to plant in the actual soil of the land. So I think what we had there was a nice greenhouse where you could adjust the conditions of water and light and soil and everything. And so while we were in the greenhouse, that was fine. But sooner or later, you had to move the plant from the greenhouse into the actual soil. And effectively, when you try and make that transfer from one environment to the other, often it fails. And that's what happened with us. And so I guess my biggest lesson would be to plant in the actual terrain, even if it's very hostile terrain, right from the very beginning. It has to be in the terrain. If a seed goes into tough terrain and does take root, then when it grows, it's likely to be stronger and able to cope with the harsh conditions.
That's a really good metaphor, but what does that mean in practice? What does it look like to plant a church in a greenhouse or to plant a church in the nation's soil?
Yeah, I guess it means from the very beginning, working with the reality of the limitations. So we were able to say, come into our house, meet in our house. There was a level of protection there. And that was a positive thing in many ways at the time. But I guess I'd say, probably what should have happened parallel to that was that we were really encouraging those young believers to be doing stuff themselves, whether it was in their own houses or if they weren't able to do that, to go and meet somewhere else. So this actually happened with some of these guys. We started this conversation. It was difficult on our team because some people said it's too early, and you could understand why they were saying that. But I knew that we weren't likely to stay there that long. And so they began to meet in this olive grove. They didn't have the freedom, or at least it wasn't enough freedom to meet in their own homes. So they started to meet in an olive grove, and they named themselves the Church of the Olive Grove. That's and cool. They had some audio Bibles they listened to. They had some worship. They would sing and pray together. That only lasted, probably only 6 months. We had to leave at a certain time, and then eventually the other foreigners also had to leave for different reasons. So the plant sort of hadn't taken root in the soil. So I'd say, it's not wrong to meet in your home where there's opportunities for that, but parallel to that, you've got to be encouraging them to work out how this relates to their own context. The other main lesson I'd say was we met a lot of single young guys who, we had a lot of freedom to share with. And once some of them had come to faith, the process of them opening up and speaking to their families was a difficult one. And some of them never did. And, the longer you leave it, the harder it becomes. This happened with another brother in Tunis, actually, before we moved down to Gabas, where he'd come to faith in some, remarkable ways. The Lord would reveal himself to him in dreams, and it was really incredible. And then I encouraged him and said, look, you need to talk to your family. Looking back on it, I regret that I hadn't myself met from the earliest days, even before he'd come to faith, with his family, so that they could get to know me, so that when he actually came to faith, this wouldn't be a strange thing. They'd say, okay, we know who you're with. We know the community you're with. We can relate to that. Otherwise, it just seems such a foreign thing. So in the case of this guy, he just kept avoiding telling his family. He was the only son. He had about 5 sisters, I think. He had a very good relationship with his father. But in the end, the context where he came out as a believer was in Ramadan, when all his family were meeting together. And one of his uncles was sort of postulating about how immoral these Christians are. They were watching some Italian TV, which Tunisians do, and people in skimpy outfits and whatever. And he said, oh, look, these Christians, they didn't treat their women well. Look at this. And he just felt this kind of indignation, rising up on him. And he just said to his uncle, that's not Christians. That's not real Christianity. That's Western culture. And just jokingly, his uncle said to him, oh, what, are you a Christian now defending them? And so he had not prepared at all for how he would talk to his family about his faith. But in that moment, he just heard Jesus' words, if you deny me before men, I will deny you before my Father. And he just knew he couldn't say no to that. So his uncle said, what, you're a Christian? He was actually probably not even being serious. And so he just said, yes, I am. And of course, it was an absolute bombshell. And first of all, his uncle thought he was just messing around, said, don't joke about these things. It's not funny. And he said, no, I am. And then his mother started wailing and screaming, and somebody else ripped their clothes. And then he was just banished for the rest of Ramadan. And it was just a really horrible sort of way for them to find out. I mean, you could say there's never an easy way to find out, but they didn't have any frame of reference to understand what is the gospel, what is true Christianity. They hadn't heard any of the stories from scripture. And later his father pulled him aside and said, look, I've always loved you. I've known you. I know that you wouldn't make a decision like this lightly. And so I'm telling you now to your face, I respect your decision, but don't ever shame me in front of my family again. So you can see the sort of power of shame, honor.
That's so much what's going on there in that moment, isn't it? It's not a matter of what is true, what's not true. It's just that shock of, what does this mean for our family? What will the relatives say? What if word gets out to the community? Are we all going to be, our businesses shut down and become pariahs? Absolutely. In that moment, it's just fear rises up, doesn't it? All over the place. And gosh, some good lessons for us there. Yeah, just the role of hospitality, which is so important, but then the outsider and the insider. And how can we be catalysts for churches to grow and disciples to be made and be multiplied? And these are things we wrestle with all the time and talk about on our teams. And
also trying to blur the lines. Sometimes we're very we've got our tidy categories of this is evangelism and this is discipleship. And what we discovered in those years in Tunis was that there were lots of people who were actually being discipled before they had professed faith in Christ openly, but they were absolutely being discipled. There's one young girl who was part of one of our groups who was coming along, reading the Bible, praying, and then even praying in the name of Jesus, but still saying, no, I'm not a Christian yet, you know, and trying to hold the two together. But you would have a lot of people who would be reading the scriptures and being influenced and impacted by having a sense of belonging to the church, but hadn't sort of publicly professed, that they were definitely believers.
And it's probably easier if they start to bring others into that journey with them before they have made that final decision, because then they can honestly say, look, I don't know. I'm exploring this guy, Jesus, Isa, and I'm looking at the Holy Injil, the gospel, and you should look with me. And they can clearly say, I'm still a Muslim, but I think we should all be looking at this together. Might make it easier, but of course, there's theory and there's just practice. Like you say, sometimes it just comes out. Okay. So those were some tougher years down south in Tunisia. I feel at this point, Pat, we should do a little bit of historical context. Our listeners may know nothing about North Africa. They may know nothing about the history of the church there. And that's something I know you teach on now at a sort of seminary level. So give us a potted summary, like with the people you were working with, Arabs or Berbers or what even is that?
Yeah. So really simply, in Tunisia, they were mostly Arabs. In Algeria, which is where most of my contact is now and where I grew up, obviously, most of them are Berbers. Amazigh or Tamazigh is the kind of official term. So sometimes when you're reading church history, it talks about Libyans, and that's to do with that region of North Africa. And normally that's referring to the original inhabitants who are the Berbers of North Africa. So if we think about the early church in that region, it's a very, very influential church, from the 2nd century right through to the 4th, 5th centuries, the likes of obviously Tertullian, who we know about, Cyprian, Augustine. I mean, these are giants of the faith. These are people who had a huge influence, obviously on the Western, church. But by about the 11th or 12th centuries, that indigenous church has largely disappeared. And it's not really until probably the 19th century that you start to see locals coming to faith. There's Catholic mission and then latterly Protestant and evangelical mission. And then what we're seeing today in the region, really in the last 20 or 30 years, is a sort of renaissance of that church. It's still numerically not that big, but as I was saying earlier, my childhood in Algeria, probably no more than 100, if that, maybe only as little as 50 believers. Nowadays, you'll hear some very grand figures. I've been doing some research on this. There's no real proper statistical data that you could say is totally verifiable, but I think a conservative estimate is that there's probably about 70, to 80,000 believers in Algeria. So it's a, numerically, that's a big growth. Tunisia, much, much less. And one of the challenges, Matt, is that there's lots of people that profess faith, that have come to faith, and as far as we know are genuine, and you could say they're converts, but within 4 or 5 years' time, they're nowhere to be seen. So they're not growing as disciples, and the churches are not necessarily kind of environments that are really helping them to be faithful or to know how it is that I should be an Algerian or a Tunisian or a Moroccan Christian in the context of these countries which have been shaped according to Islam, or in Algeria, shaped according to the idea of being an Arab state and an Islamic state, which is a huge problem for many Algerians because many of them are not Arab ethnically. They've been Arabized, but they're not Arab. So the church has grown in that contested space really about what does it mean to be Algerian. And one of the huge challenges is how movements of converts actually end up being disciples who are who are in discipling communities who will not only give birth to other disciples, but also will have an impact on the transformation of society. And so that's really that's the world I inhabit. And that's what I teach on. So I teach with an Algerian Bible college that I was involved in starting back in 2013. That's very much sort of fairly underground. I mean, there is a legal statute for Christians in Algeria, but it's only according to association law. So there is the Protestant Church of Algeria, which is a registered association, and the training happens under the umbrella of that particular entity. Yeah.
Wow, that is interesting. Early on in the Royal Mission podcast series, actually, one of our long-term workers in South Asia was talking to me about a similar kind of thing, really, where there were maybe 1,000 believers, but he felt like none of them became disciples. They weren't really gathered. They didn't form churches. And he has big regrets about how that all happened in the early days and wishes he'd done it all over again in a different way. And he wasn't the only one involved, of course, but there were locals too. But yeah, it's a big question. What do you think? I don't know, give us some tips or some lessons learned over the years, or how the Algerian church itself is trying to work through these questions.
Well, gosh, I mean, it's so complex and it's so hard to kind of simplify it. I think what you have in Algeria is a whole complex bunch of factors. So the church from, let's say, the early 2000s right up until 2016, 17 had a lot of freedom, and the church was able to grow and be quite public. And what happened was it was quite an emphasis on public buildings and the importance of meeting in public. Now, a number of people quickly criticize that for understandable reasons, say, well, is that the best model? House churches are surely where real growth can happen. And that's true. But what the Algerians said, and I witnessed this, was that the public buildings created a kind of opportunity for lots of Algerians who were curious, who would never go into someone else's house who wasn't part of their family or tribe, and just go and observe and listen. And lots of Algerians came to faith through these kind of public church buildings. But of course, what's happened in the last 4 or 5 years is that it's very easy for the government then, with a change of will and direction and emphasis, to say, right, we're shutting this down. And that's exactly what they've done. There's been a huge number of churches that have been forcibly closed. The government claims that they're not registered places of worship, but when the churches have tried to register them, they've not received registration. So typically you've got a house or a villa or even a building that's been built on someone's private land, and they want to register it as a place of worship so that it's official. But the government won't accept that registration. They say it should be registered according to the Protestant Church of Algeria. And in a few cases where they've tried to do that, where people have given over their land, it also hasn't been registered. So there are no examples of churches. So the only official churches in Algeria are the ones that were historically there before independence. And the Protestant church at that time was essentially a foreign organization. Now it's a 100% Algerian-led organization. So yes, I guess they're now realizing the weakness of having emphasized these church buildings as a key place for believers to meet, and sort of learning again the importance of discipling in small groups in an environment where there's more hostility from the government and more persecution. So I think it's not necessarily a question of either or. There is a place for public places, but it can't be to the neglect of the real discipleship that happens. I guess the other thing I'd say in terms of lessons is it has to be life on life. There are some great courses out there, and there are wonderful courses being developed which are much more attuned to the kind of challenges and the issues and the contextual problems that believers of Muslim background have, but nothing quite replaces life on life. And for overseas workers, often we don't realize the impact and the importance of this. So you might meet someone who's keen, who's intelligent, who's gobbling up the scriptures, and you think, this person is really hungry, and you assume they're mature as they're growing, and maybe they'll be elevated into positions of leadership. But I've seen it numerous times where that's happened, where you suddenly discover they've got an absolute double life. There's, sexual sin going on. There's embezzlement of funds, and, you would never have realized this. And the only way you can pick up on that stuff is when you're doing life on life discipleship, when you're somehow living together. But that's a massive challenge for an overseas worker. You can't live with someone 24/7. So yeah, those are just few lessons.
Sharing this podcast is a great way to encourage more people to get involved with God's great mission, whether locally or globally. Perhaps you know someone whose faith might be strengthened, or God's call to evangelism and disciple-making might be ignited by listening to this very episode. So do share it or any of your favorite episodes with your friends. If you use Apple Podcasts, it's really easy to give us a 5-star rating or to write us a review. And this has a big impact on how many people can find us. One more thing, guys. If you're in the UK, we'd love to see you at our annual conference day, which is happening soon. It's called Neighbours and Nations. It's on Saturday the 23rd of November in High Wycombe. It's a great chance to connect with us, meet workers and hear their stories, and to get equipped to reach out to your Muslim neighbours and friends. Our guest speaker on the day will be the author and church leader Phil Moore. He'll be talking about the book he's just written about the Iranian church and its remarkable growth in recent years, called The Forgotten Manifesto of Jesus. Do come along. To book, visit the events page on our website, frontiers.org.uk, or you can go to the link I'm going to put in the show notes for the Eventbrite ticket page. It's a free conference with a free lunch, and we really hope we see you there. Thanks, guys. Now let's get back to the interview. Your point about discipleship is really interesting, and one-on-one discipleship, because it's very easy to hear statistics of great media ministries, blasting the gospel in on satellites and internet now and all this sort of stuff over the years. And, this amount of people are coming to faith in the Muslim world. But it begs a lot of questions. Well, who's following that up? Who's discipling them? There's only so much you can do online in a little group, in a chat room or something. You have to walk a walk with people. Yeah. You have to do church with people, whatever it looks like, whatever building you're in. So I think that's definitely a really important point that you've made. And so the value of workers on the ground. It doesn't matter if they come from, China or New Zealand or Latin America or, other Arabs coming across from Egypt into North Africa. It doesn't matter who they are, but somebody's got to be there on the ground, pushing the boundaries of the kingdom, doing evangelism, but doing discipleship and church planting work.
Yeah.
So that's hugely important from what you're saying.
And facilitating and encouraging fellowship from the very earliest stages, that to be a disciple of Christ is never a solo thing. And that should always be the exception, that if we belong to Christ, we belong to a body, and we have brothers and sisters, as difficult as they are, as annoying, as irritating, as problematic. It's just God's purpose to grow us in community and in the body of Christ.
And if there is no church to join, then you bring others from your family and your network and make church. Yeah. I mean, that's the only other way sometimes in some of these contexts.
Yeah, absolutely.
The other question that comes to mind for me in that scenario, you've talked a little bit about state opposition or persecution. What about, as the church was growing, whether in Tunisia or much more so in Algeria, was there personal opposition as well? Were there early martyrdoms in the recent history of the church growing there?
Yes, definitely. Not on the level that you've seen maybe in Iran or in some parts of Pakistan. I think I only know of one believer who was killed for his faith in Algeria. None others that I can think of. Others that died, but not directly, really on account of their faith. But certainly massive social, being ostracized socially or culturally, depending on what your family is like and what your relationship is like, either being banished, never to be seen again, or just, put out in the cold. Obviously, limitations to promotions in the workplace or what kind of jobs you can do in the public sphere. So there's a whole lot of that, lots of examples of that. Again, because there are all sorts of things that are assumed, if you're a Christian, you must be this, that, or the next thing. There's all kinds of narratives and myths about, foreign involvement, that the church exists in this place as a sort of a pretext for foreign Western governments to control what's going on. So you've got all that kind of narrative kicking off.
Neocolonialism.
At the moment in Algeria, it's not clear why the position has changed as much as it has. I mean, there's a different president and a different chief of staff of the military. And I think they've always tried to appease the Islamists who are very unhappy about the existence of this apostate church. There's also, I think, pressure from Gulf states, from places like Saudi Arabia and other places which have, financially invest in these North African countries. And sometimes it's with the condition that you sort out this problem, this shameful problem of Christians in your midst. That has been the case previously.
So what would you say are some of your highlight stories? We talked about transformation of community is so important, and whether it's just personal anecdotes where their families or community have really been transformed by the emergence of the church and young disciples making a difference?
Yeah, I'm so privileged now, Matt. I've seen a lot of this now because my role has moved from being primarily focused on North Africa to having insights into what's going on in a lot of other majority Muslim contexts. So I work with a partnership called the Hikmah Partnership, which is committed to a number of things, supporting training, writing, research done by believers of Muslim background, addressing the challenges that they face, and also kind of amplifying their voices so that people like you and me who live in the West or in the rest of the world, perhaps from the global North, get to learn from what God is doing amongst our brothers and sisters. I mean, some of the stories are just utterly amazing. Well, I'll give you a couple of examples. I was mentioning this dear friend of mine who came to faith actually in 2001, is still just gone on with the Lord. He's in leadership. He's a worship leader. He's a teacher. He's an elder in his church. And recently his mum passed away. And at the funeral, which he financed and organized with his sisters, he was attacked in the most horrible way by one of his brothers. And when I asked him about this, I said, what was the provocation? He said, there was no provocation. I said, was this because you were a believer? And he said, well, yes and no. He says, I think it's really because I'm a good person in the real sense of the word. I said, what do you mean? He said that my brother's known that I've been a Christian for a long time. Everyone in the family knows. But what had happened, this brother had spent time in prison. He's a really very unpleasant person. And when he came out of prison, he extorted their mother's pensions payments and basically lived off that. So she hardly had anything. And effectively, my friend and his sisters looked after her, paid for her accommodation right through to when she died. And all this came out at the funeral. Basically they had looked after her. And his brother was just very, very, very ashamed. And his brother and his brother's son literally tried to kill him at this funeral. And there were lots of people there who were both from his church and from the neighborhood who know him as a very upright person. And they stepped in to help him. So he was helped at that time. But people said to him, you have to kind of hit him back and you have to do something because he's dishonored you in front of everyone. And my friend said, no, we're not going to do that. I am going to take this to the courts and go through the police because we have to deal with this. But I was just really encouraged by, it was horrible to think of that happening, but just encouraged to think, wow, the years of discipleship in this guy's life has translated into very tangible expressions of love for his family, which are very visible to the wider family and the neighborhood. And, the enemy hates that. So yeah, that's one story. I'll tell you another story, which I heard, and this was from West Africa. One of the guys, we have a steering group that leads the Hikmah Partnership, and I'm privileged to be working with very mature believers of Muslim background. And this guy is one of the leaders from Togo who's been a believer for a number of years. And he was telling me the story about his sister who he had led to the Lord. He comes from a very prominent Muslim family. The whole area is, his brother led him to the Lord. He came to the Lord. Eventually they led his sisters to the Lord, but she was already married to a Muslim man and had 3 kids. And when her father-in-law found out, he said, you need to recant your faith. She said, I can't do that. And a little bit like, I don't know if you just know the story of Perpetua and Felicitas from the early church, who was one of the early martyrs in North Africa. This lady said, look, I'm never going to deny my Lord. And she had an 8-year-old, a 10-year-old, and a 6-month-old who was still, she was still weaning. And they took the kids. They said, right, then the kids are ours. They'll be raised Muslim. You're banished, basically. Yeah. And then the father-in-law stepped in and ripped the 6-month-old baby from her arms. And, you can imagine the scene. It was awful. Fortunately, the Muslim tribal elder came and said, no, you give the weaning baby back. When the baby stops weaning, we'll come and take the child and they'll be raised a Muslim. Well, she left that area and went to a neighboring city. She was a nurse. She worked in a hospital, went with her 6-month-old son and worked in the hospital. Sometime later, that father-in-law became very ill and ended up in the hospital in ITU. And she ended up being the nurse that nursed him back to health through this illness. He had no idea at the time, but as he began to come around and to recover, he realized that it was this daughter-in-law of his. And, obviously as an opportunity, her life had been really harmed by this man and their attitude. And she had chosen to forgive him and to love him. And God had opened the way for her to express that very tangibly. And he was so moved by this. He publicly before his family said, we wronged you. You are a good woman. And kind of we in front of his family effectively repented. I'm not sure if he's come to faith or not, but they basically said these are good people, and she's been restored to her family. So that's a good news story, if you like.
And got all her kids back then, presumably, because she'd had the baby boy.
Has.
The other two.
She's got her kids back, and she's back living with her husband. Her husband is a believer now as well.
Amazing.
Now, of course, there are plenty of other stories where it hasn't ended quite as straightforwardly as that.
But that is the impact of the gospel. That's the Jesus we believe in. That's what transforms society, let alone our own souls and our own lives and so on. But that's what we're praying for, to see this kind of thing. Families transformed by this kind of love, radical obedience to Jesus. Wow. So inspiring. Yeah. Pat, give us any other highlight stories, whether good or bad, from your time overseas, or if you want to just fast forward into what you're doing now with Hikmah and anything else. Any tips you'd like to leave us with, advice for young folks thinking about serving overseas one day? Bring us into land with a couple more things.
I want to encourage all the listeners to recognize this kind of twin realities, that God is doing amazing things and is so powerfully at work today, but life is really, really hard. It's hard for those who come to Christ and who decide to live openly and publicly for him in majority Muslim context. There is nowhere where Christ isn't at work. One of the guys on our steering group is just an utterly remarkable character. He's an apostolic figure. He's come to faith from a very, very prominent Muslim family. I won't say in detail who they are on this podcast, but his story is unbelievable. And he has opportunities to be sharing, baptizing people. He's baptized literally thousands of people in every possible place you could imagine, including Mecca. And more than one person. And yes, there are churches in Mecca today, and not just there, but in many other places. And he told us a story. This was a couple of years ago, and I've, in sharing this with you, I know there's a danger of sensationalizing these things, but I share it just to say that somehow the times that we are living now feel almost like the apostolic period. And by the way, you might ask me questions about the story I'm about to tell you, Matt. And I probably won't have answers to them, but I believe his testimony. And he was contacted by a tribal leader in the Libyan desert, a sort of nomadic peoples. And their message was, we've met Jesus and we need to get baptized. And we know that we need a sheikh to teach us, to mentor us. Well, nothing that strange about that. As you know, from, I'm sure, interacting with people working in the Muslim world, the Lord Jesus is revealing himself in dreams all the time. A number of believers I know, that's been their first encounter with Christ. So nothing unusual there. So he does this huge journey of about 1,500 kilometers across the desert to meet this guy. Meets him, his wife, and about 5 or 6 other members of his closer family within this tribe that he leads. And he says, tell me about your dream. He said, no, we didn't have a dream. He just walked into our tent at midday and stayed with us for 6 hours and then disappeared.
Wow.
So my friend's like, what? Hang on a sec. What do you mean? So they just described someone who was Sheikh min al-shuyukh, he said, like the greatest of sheikhs, came with us. We offered him tea and he had tea with us, and he sat and just told us stories and talked to us. And so my friend has since had, I think, 3 meetings with them and is basically discipling them. And what he does is he reads the scriptures, and he was reading through John recently, and they said, yes, he talked to us about that. So he's also met with you. And my friend said, well, not like he has with you. And then they would then go on and tell the rest of the story, having not been exposed to the scriptures. And they described him being with them for, as I say, 5 or 6 hours. They offered him, food to stay the night, and then he disappeared. But, they could see everything from all around. And so they saw who was coming and who was going. Anyway, I heard the story and I was just like, okay, I don't know what category to put that in. I mean, the last time I heard of that happening, it was on the road to Emmaus, right? And it was something very similar to that. And so I took away from that there are people who are hungry and seeking the Lord, and God is revealing himself in incredible ways. But the flip side, so that's the exciting stuff. And there are quite a few stories like that. The flip side is that life is very, very, very difficult. And the ministry, I guess, that I'm involved in with Hikmah is really addressing the next chapter in the story. So what happens to this movement as it grows in Christ? How is the church going to have an impact on majority Muslim societies? In the spiritual realm, we know that those changes are not going to happen lightly. And I don't know if you know this figure, Matt, but something like 80% of those who profess faith in Christ, as far as we know, genuine professions, conversions, 80% of those within 5 years' time are nowhere to be seen in the church. And so where do they go? Some of them go back to Islam. Some of them drift into forms of secular humanism. Some of them are disillusioned by the experience of church once they actually start to encounter this as a big issue, that just what they see within the life of the church. And I don't just mean the Western church, but other churches, it falls so far short of what they had hoped for, or what they'd seen in the scriptures or in the person of Jesus, that they become disillusioned. So there's lots of reasons. But that's really something that needs addressing.
It's a hard reality. I mean, it'd be fascinating to know a similar kind of statistic looking at the Western church, because it's probably not that different here either. You know, folks who start strongly with the Lord and then just drift away, or, you know, whether it's the temptations of this world or the comfort and ease of life in a wealthy nation, and they just drift away from their faith. But that's definitely a big challenge to hear that. So that definitely has lessons for us. Not sure what exactly they are, but definitely to be aware of that and to work hard on discipleship, longevity. You know, we want to see people walking with Jesus for the rest of their days and having an impact on societies, don't we? We don't want to count numbers of converts. That's not what we're about. We want to see lives transformed, societies transformed.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's a great challenge for us. Thank you, Roy. Yeah, brilliant, Pat. It's been a real joy. Give me maybe one or two of your favorite scriptures that either the Lord used to provoke you into this kind of ministry, to draw you into this ministry, or something that sustained you over the years. You know, what have you held on to that has just kept you going?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different ones. I think I've been spending a lot of time meditating recently on Ephesians. I love the book. And in that first half, there are these verses here which speak about what our purpose is. And I'll just read them from chapter 2 and verses 19 to 22. Consequently, you are no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens with God's people, and also members of his household, built on the foundations of the apostles and the prophets, with Christ Jesus himself as the chief cornerstone. In him, the whole building is joined together and rises to become a holy temple of the Lord. And in him, you two are being built together to become a dwelling in which God lives by his Spirit. So you have these different metaphors. You've got the metaphor of citizenship. You've got the metaphor of being a household or a family. And then you've got the metaphor of a building and of kind of living stones with Christ Jesus himself as the chief cornerstone. And Paul mixes his metaphors here, and he does it in other places as well. And what we're talking about with what God is doing in the Muslim world is really to do with a new wing in the household of God. Not an annex, not an outhouse, not some quaint little exotic thing over in the corner, but actually part of our household. And in a sense, that wing is growing and will benefit the whole household. And so I really believe that, you know, what we're seeing in the Muslim world is going to be definitely a new center of the world Christian movement, but also one that will help influence, I think, the decaying church in the West. There are insights, there are perspectives. Just recently, I was involved with my Egyptian colleague and Tim Green, who also works in the same organization. And we were doing a course, a sort of seminary level course, which was called BMB Perspectives on Theology, Identity and Community. And it was a 15-week course where all the experts were just BMBs who were speaking into different topics and themes. And it was so rich. And I'm encouraged that we're part of a family that is growing. We have these deep foundations, but the story is going on.
That's right. I love it. And I love that you get to bring that history of the church in Africa perspective when you're doing some of your teaching out there. But I love that image of the house growing and what we have to learn from those coming into the kingdom in recent years. We're seeing it. We've seen it for years already in the UK from what we're learning from African believers here. Yeah. And now definitely from Asians as well. And even in the missions movement, we're learning so much from our Latino brothers and sisters. And to feel this is another wing that the Lord is building and teaching us from. We have a conference coming up. You'll probably hear an advert on the show this November, but Phil Moore's coming to talk to us about a new book he's written about what he's learned from the Iranian church and how that has to shape the UK church going forward. And that's it. We want to hear those voices. You know, I want to hear people who've lived the faith in those tough contexts.
You've absolutely hit it on the head. And you're right to make that link. As you said, we've been enriched by our brothers and sisters from, you know, Latino backgrounds, from sub-Saharan African backgrounds, for East Asian backgrounds, and that's enriching the church. Some people saying the evangelical church, the only reason it's not stagnating in the UK is thanks to those streams coming in to influence us. And then you're getting this affecting the whole way in which we view church. I mean, the church is being revitalized up and down the UK by Syrian and Iranian believers. Some of them, more than 50% of their congregations are coming from that background. And of course, that's challenging how we do church, how we do worship, how we organize ourselves. But fundamentally, it's making us more authentic and increasingly more courageous as well in a sort of radically secular environment where we've been so frightened to speak out. So I think it's really good. And, the whole intercultural churches movement is affected by that. One of the branches so I've talked to you about the Hikmah Partnership, which is linked to a sort of host organization called Word of Life. And one of the tracks of that is called Joining the Family. And that's, that's a ministry that's really trying to engage mainstream churches in the West, understand the particular stories of BMBs, their perspectives, but also to welcome them in, not just as kind of trophy conversions or great stories about how God has worked, but, poster boys and girls, but actually members of our family coming into positions of leadership, influencing the way our churches function. So
yeah, that's good. We'll put the links to that, those great courses that Tim's been involved with as well, hasn't he? Come Follow Me, Discipling Muslim Background Believers or Believers from a Muslim Background, and Joining the Family. And I think that's great. You shouted out the intercultural church movement. Adam, our friend, runs that in the UK, so we might put that in the notes. And a big shout out, I think, finally to your fantastic wife, Kitty, good friends of us as well. But, she's supported you in so many ways and has her own ministries over the years, both overseas and here. And so, it's a family thing. It's a church thing, all of this, isn't it?
Can I finish by reading a short spoken word that I wrote just 10 days ago?
Yeah.
It's definitely relevant to what we're talking about. And it might encourage your listeners as they think about, what it is to be involved in God's mission in the world today and how to balance these different aspects. I called it 5 Loaves and 2 Fish. And I wrote it after the first night I was at the Lausanne 4 Congress, which was amazingly encouraging.
In South Korea.
Yeah. So 5,300 of us Christians in one place. Amazing time to worship. But I was wrestling with how we understand our mission and the balance between the importance of thinking strategically and collaborating and having the right data and all that stuff, which is important. But the other side of it, which is just the kind of like, we're just like that boy with 5 loaves and 2 fish. And what on earth are we going to do? And he just offered up what he had. And what does Jesus do? He gives thanks for that and then multiplies it. So it's that tension between mission sometimes is about brokenness. It's about, we fail and that's okay. God uses our failures. And on the other hand, it's about thinking carefully and clearly. And I thought this might encourage go for it. Your readers. It's called 5 Loaves and 2 Fish. They say the mission's too great. The world is vast. The hour too late. But I see hands stretched wide, open hearts, not broken walls, but brand new starts. Church, we've been called, you and I, to reach the corners where shadows lie, not with towers of strength or perfect plans, but with the offering of humble hands. Like the boy with 5 loaves, 2 fish, small in size, but great in wish. He didn't know how it would multiply, but he trusted the hands that reached to the sky. And in those hands, Jesus breaks the bread, feeds the hungry where hearts are led. He reveals himself to those who seek, to the lost, the weary, the wandering meek. Yes, we'll need our skills, our minds, our means, our strategies, teams, and organizational schemes. But don't mistake them as the key to the door, for the power that moves is something more. It's not innovation that sets hearts free, but faith in the God of eternity. Yet still, we bring all that we know, trusting he'll breathe life into what we sow. The whole church to the whole world he calls, across borders and lines, breaking walls, a gospel for every tribe, every tongue, a song of redemption yet to be sung. A united body from all generations, bridging cultures and professions and nations, elevating Christ in unity's might. As one we reflect his glorious light. It's not about riches or the biggest nest, but each soul offering up their best. God's strategy, it's not ours to see. He asks us to give and trust faithfully. Because 5 loaves can feed a multitude. 2 fish can change the world's attitude. When hands unite, when faith takes flight, the least reach will be reached tonight. So bring what you have, your voice, your song. Your heart's small gift won't steer you wrong. In a world connected, heart to heart, together we can do our part. The whole church, with the whole gospel in hand, to reach every soul in every land.
Wow, that is fantastic. Thanks, bro. I didn't know you had the gift of spoken word and poetry. I'm going to, get a printout of that for sure, and we'll have a look at that from time to time. Been a joy, bro, to have you with us. One of my oldest and best friends on the show. It's been a while coming. Been meaning to get you on.
Yeah.
But thanks for being here today. You've really opened our eyes, I think, to what God's doing in North Africa and beyond, and given us plenty of wisdom. We haven't even talked about your own PhD, which I think was around North African church as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, that'll be for another edition.
Exactly. Thanks for being with us today.
Yeah.
God bless.
Thanks a lot, Matt. Bless you.
Thanks for joining us today, guys. To get in touch, do check us out on our website, frontiers.org.uk, and on all social media platforms at Frontiers UK. Let's finish with a great quote from Lilias Trotter, artist and missionary in North Africa in the early 1900s. Measure thy life by loss and not by gain, not by the wine drunk, but by the wine poured forth. For love's strength standeth in love's sacrifice, and he who suffers most has most to give. That's a serious challenge, isn't it? How are we measuring our lives? What are we spending our time, energy, and money on? Who are we investing in? Have a great week, and make sure you don't miss our next episode.